A poor rancher was exiled for rescuing a wild horse. Cast out of his own valley, he lit a lonely fire under the stars, ready to face the world alone. But at dawn, thunder shook the ground. 200 wild horses circled his camp, their silver-maned leader standing guard at his side. The church bell tolls. Dust swirls. Whispers spread across the town. Why did the herd come to him? And what secret bond ties these horses to land stolen long ago? With nothing but faith and grit, the outcast must choose run with the herd into hiding or stand against a cattle baron who claims the river, the valley, and every soul who dares resist. Keys rattle in the jail. A boy cries out. Hooves strike the earth like war drums. Exiled, surrounded, and hunted. What will happen when one man's act of mercy sets the valley ablaze? And when the herd rides free, will he finally find a home or lose everything once more? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The morning sun crept over the eastern hills, painting the valley in soft, golden light. Eli Ransom's weathered hands worked steadily, driving another nail into the weathered board of his corral. The sharp crack of his hammer echoed across the small patch of land he called home, though the sound felt hollow without Sarah there to hear it. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with a dusty sleeve. His gaze drifted to the cabin where he and Sarah had started their life together. The morning glories she'd planted still climbed the porch posts, their purple blooms reaching toward the sky like prayers. 3 years since the fever took her, and some mornings he still woke, expecting to smell coffee brewing on the wood stove. The corral rail swayed under his touch, reminding him of his task. Time was, he'd been one of the valley's respected ranchers. Now his spread had dwindled to these few acres, his herd to a handful of cattle. Folks who'd once sought his counsel at church socials now turned away when he passed on the street, afraid Sutter might notice them being friendly. A series of rifle cracks split the morning quiet, followed by angry shouts. Eli's head snapped up, his hammer forgotten. He whistled for his horse, an old bay gelding that came trotting from the shade of a cottonwood. In moments, he was in the saddle, riding toward the commotion. The scene that greeted him in the narrow draw made his blood run cold. 4 of Sutter's men had a magnificent wild stallion cornered, its silver mane flying as it fought against their ropes. The horse's eyes rolled white with terror as the men tried to drag it down, whooping and cursing. Easy now. Eli called out, but his voice was lost in the chaos. The stallion reared, screaming its defiance. One of the men raised his rifle without thinking. Eli spurred his horse forward. His knife flashed in the morning sun as he slashed through the nearest rope. The stallion lunged, breaking free of the second line. Eli positioned himself between the men and the horse, giving it the space it needed to escape. "What in blazes do you think you're doing?" one of Sutter's men shouted. But Eli kept his eyes on the stallion until it disappeared into the brush. The thunder of approaching hooves announced Clive Sutter's arrival. He sat tall in his tooled leather saddle, his face dark with fury as he surveyed the scene. "Well, if it ain't Eli Ransom," he drawled, each word dripping with venom. "Stealing my property now, are we?" "That horse belongs to no man," Eli said quietly, though his heart hammered in his chest. "And you know it. Sutter, that stallion's been running my mares off for months." Sutter's voice carried across the draw, where curious townsfolk had begun to gather. "And now we find you helping it escape. Sounds like horse theft to me. What do you say, boys?" His men muttered agreement, hands resting meaningfully on their gun belts. Eli noticed familiar faces in the growing crowd. People he'd known for years, but they looked away when he met their eyes. "There'll be a council meeting tonight," Sutter announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, "to discuss what we do with horse thieves in this valley." He spurred his horse closer to Eli, dropping his voice. Best pack your bags, Ransom. Your time here's done. The town hall's oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the rough-hewn walls as the council gathered that evening. Judge Henderson sat at the head of the long table, his expression troubled as Sutter laid out his case. The room was packed with Valley residents, though few would meet Eli's steady gaze. "We can't have men taking the law into their own hands," Sutter declared, pacing before the council. "That stallion's been causing trouble for honest ranchers. Ransom here prevented its legitimate capture and cost my men a day's work besides." Eli stood when called upon to speak. "That horse was being tormented," he said simply. "I did what any decent man would do. There was no theft, just mercy." A murmur ran through the crowd, but Sutter's voice cut through it like a whip. "Mercy? What about mercy for the ranchers trying to protect their stock? What about the rule of law?" Old Tom Wheeler, who'd helped Eli raise his barn 15 years ago, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Martha Jensen, whose child Sarah had nursed through croup, studied her hands folded in her lap. The silence in the room spoke volumes. Judge Henderson cleared his throat. "Given the circumstances and the complaint brought by Mr. Sutter, ... double quotes, he paused, glancing at Sutter's stern face. "I believe it best for the peace of the valley if Mr. Ransom removes himself from our community." By sundown tomorrow, the words fell like stones in still water. Eli stood straight-backed, dignity his only shield against the shame of exile. "I'll go," he said quietly. "But remember this day. Remember how easy it is to stand silent while wrong is done." The ride back to his cabin seemed longer than usual. The familiar trail strange in the gathering dusk. Inside, Eli lit a lamp and looked around at the home he and Sarah had built. Her quilt still brightened the walls, and her Bible lay on the shelf where she'd left it. He packed what he could in his saddlebags, some clothes, tools, the photograph of their wedding day, and Sarah's Bible. The sun was setting when he mounted up, painting the western sky in fierce oranges and purples. Eli took one last look at the cabin, at the morning glories Sarah had loved, at the crooked fence he'd never finish mending. Then he turned his horse toward the valley's edge, where the unknown waited. He rode with his head high, though his heart ached with the injustice of it all. The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and summer dust, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called, a lonely sound that seemed to echo his own situation. But as he crossed the boundary of what had been his land, Eli felt something else beneath the grief and anger, a quiet resolve. Strong as the bedrock beneath the valley soil, they could take his land, his standing in the community, even his home. But they couldn't take his integrity. In saving that wild horse, he'd chosen right over easy, just as Sarah would have wanted. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it, knowing he'd stayed true to himself. The last rays of sunlight caught his face as Eli Ransom rode away from everything he'd known, leaving behind a valley where power spoke louder than justice, and where good men's silence allowed darkness to flourish. The dry creek bed offered little comfort. As Eli made his solitary camp that night, he spread his bedroll beneath a gnarled cottonwood, its bare branches scratching at the star-filled sky. The evening air carried a bitter chill, matching the hollow feeling in his chest. Exile was a cold companion. Sleep came in fits and starts. Every snapping twig jolted him awake, his mind replaying the day's humiliation. When the false dawn finally began to paint the eastern sky in pale grays, Eli stirred and pushed himself up on one elbow. Then he froze, his breath catching in his throat. Horses, hundreds of them, they stood like living shadows in the pre-dawn light, surrounding his camp in a great circle. Some grazed on the sparse grass, others dozed standing, but all seemed drawn to this spot as if by an unseen hand. At their center, Barely 20 paces from Eli's bedroll stood the silver-maned stallion he'd freed from Sutter's men. Eli's legs trembled as he rose to his knees. "Lord above," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. The morning air filled with the soft sounds of 200 horses breathing, shuffling, existing together in peaceful communion. The stallion's coat gleamed like morning frost, his proud head held high as he watched over both herd and man. "I reckon this is your doing," Eli murmured skyward, "though I surely don't understand the why of it." His hands shook as he bowed his head in gratitude. The morning wore on as Eli tended his small camp. He built up the fire with dried cottonwood branches, brewing coffee in his battered tin pot. His own mount, a sturdy bay gelding, seemed content among the wild herd, grazing peacefully nearby. The silver stallion maintained his vigil, never straying far from where Eli worked. Near midday, Eli heard hoofbeats approaching, not the scattered sounds of wild horses, but the steady rhythm of trained mounts. He straightened slowly, one hand resting near his holstered revolver. Two riders emerged from a stand of juniper trees, a woman and a boy, both sitting their horses with natural grace. The woman wore a simple dress and shawl, her dark hair pulled back in a neat braid. Her face carried both beauty and gravity, weathered by sun and care. The boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, watched Eli with undisguised curiosity from beneath the brim of his too-large hat. "I am Annika Snowbird," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "This is my son, David." She spoke English well, though her words carried the gentle lilt of her Cherokee tongue. "We saw the herd from our cabin. I knew they would come." Eli nodded slowly, reading no threat in their presence. "Eli Ransom, ma'am?" "Though I expect you already knew that, given yesterday's commotion." "We did," she acknowledged. "The valley has many ears, Mr. Ransom, and news travels fast." She dismounted with fluid grace, helping David down after her. "These horses once roamed free under my husband's care before he passed." He understood them, spoke their language in his heart. "What happened?" Eli asked softly, gesturing for them to join him by the fire. Annika's face tightened slightly. "Sutter happened. He began fencing off the grazing land, piece by piece. The waterholes, the meadows, all claimed by his paper laws and barbed wire. My husband tried to fight it, but ... double quotes, she trailed off, her hand unconsciously moving to touch her son's shoulder. David looked up at Eli with solemn eyes. "Papa said the horses needed to run free, like the wind. But then he got sick, and Sutter's men came with their fences." Eli poured coffee into tin cups, offering them to his guests. The silver stallion moved closer, as if listening to their conversation. "And now?" he asked. "Now we need your help," Annika said directly. "The reservation lands to the north have good grazing, clean water. The tribal council would welcome these horses back. They remember my husband's work. But we cannot drive them alone, and the journey is not safe." Eli studied the coffee in his cup. "Ma'am, I'm grateful for your trust, but I'm already in more trouble than a man needs. Sutter's reach is long, longer than Providence." Annika asked quietly. She gestured at the gathered herd. 200 horses didn't appear at your camp by chance, Mr. Ransom. Some would call that a sign." The morning light caught the silver stallion's coat, making him shine like a beacon. Eli remembered the moment he'd cut that rope, freeing the magnificent animal from Sutter's men. It had felt right then, and something in his heart stirred now, watching the great horse stand guard over him. "You speak truth," he admitted finally, "though it may bring more grief than glory." David's face lit up. "Then you'll help us." Eli couldn't help but smile at the boy's eagerness. "Reckon I will. Though your mama's right, it won't be an easy drive." They shared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, planning their route as the sun climbed higher. Annika knew the land well, marking out water holes and safe passages on a rough map drawn in the dirt. David listened intently, occasionally adding his own observations about the terrain with a child's clear memory. The silver stallion remained close, his presence a constant reminder of what had brought them together. Other horses from the herd drifted near, drawn perhaps by the quiet conversation or the scent of food. In the late afternoon light, their coats gleamed like copper and gold. "We'll start at first light," Eli said finally, studying the dying embers of their fire. "The herd seems calm enough, and that stallion, double quotes." He shook his head in wonder. "Never seen anything like it. He's keeping them together like he knows what's coming." Annika nodded, her dark eyes reflecting understanding. "Some things are meant to be, Mr. Ransom. My people believe that spirits guide us, if we have the wisdom to follow." She rose gracefully, helping David to his feet. "We'll return before dawn with supplies." As they mounted their horses to leave, David turned back to Eli. "Papa would have liked you," he said simply. He believed in helping horses stay free too. Eli watched them ride away, their figures growing smaller against the setting sun. The silver stallion moved closer, his breath warm in the cooling air. Eli reached out slowly, letting his hand rest on the horse's strong neck. The coat felt like silk beneath his fingers. "Well, old son," he murmured, "reckon we're in this together now." The stallion's ear flicked toward his voice, and Eli could have sworn the horse nodded in agreement around them. The herd grazed peacefully in the gathering dusk, 200 strong and somehow his responsibility. Eli added more wood to his fire, preparing for another night under the stars. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Providence, it seemed, had other plans for his exile. At first light, a thin mist clung to the ground as Eli, Annika, and David mounted their horses. The great herd stretched before them like a living sea, 200 strong, their coats painted gold by the rising sun. The silver stallions stood apart, watching them with ears pricked forward. "First rule of herding," Eli said softly to David, who sat straight-backed on his pony. "Stay downwind of that stallion. He's the key to moving them all." The boy nodded eagerly, his dark eyes bright with attention. "Like smoke from a fire?" David asked. "Just so," Eli replied, pleased by the boy's quick understanding. "Wind carries our scent. We want him choosing the path, not spooking from us." Annika moved her horse alongside them, her long black hair bound back with a leather tie. "My husband always said a gentle hand moves more than a hard one," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority. They began their slow circuit around the herd, Eli whistling soft signals that carried on the morning air. The horses lifted their heads at the sound, ears swiveling to track his calls. The silver stallion snorted once, then began walking south, his herd falling in behind him like water flowing around stones. "See how they move together." Eli called to David. "That's the natural way. No ropes needed, just patience." The boy beamed at learning something new, sitting taller in his saddle. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Dust rose from hundreds of hooves, coating their clothes and faces with fine red powder. Eli's throat grew parched, but he kept whistling his signals, guiding the herd's flow around obstacles with gentle pressure from their riding horses. By noon, the heat had become fierce. Eli spotted a broad cottonwood standing alone on a rise, its shade beckoning like an oasis. "Let's rest the horses," he called. The herd would graze nearby, giving them all a needed break from the punishing sun. They dismounted in the blessed shade, their faces streaked with dust and reddened from sun exposure. Annika reached into her saddlebag and brought out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Cornbread," she said, breaking it into shares. "Made fresh yesterday morning." David accepted his portion eagerly, but his eyes were distant as he chewed. "Papa used to talk about this," he said quietly. "A free herd, running where they pleased. He said horses don't care if a man's Cherokee or settler. They just know if he's kind or cruel." Eli saw Annika's face soften at her son's words. She reached out and smoothed David's hair, a gesture full of gentle pride and old grief. The afternoon proved as grueling as the morning. Their waterskins ran low, and the sun seemed to hang forever in the western sky. But finally, darkness began to creep across the land. They found a small stream cutting through a shallow valley, its banks lined with enough grass for the herd to settle. Eli got a fire going while Annika prepared a simple stew from dried meat and wild onions she'd gathered along the way. David helped collect firewood, proud to contribute despite his obvious exhaustion from the long day's ride. The flames cast dancing shadows as they ate. In that quiet moment, with crickets chirping and the horses moving softly in the darkness beyond their circle of light, words came easier. "Lost my Sarah 3 years back," Eli said, his voice rough with memory. "Fever took her quick. Afterward, seemed like folks just forgot about me. Or didn't want to remember." He poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spinning upward. "A man alone, they reckon, ain't worth much mind." Annika nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "The world can be cold to those who walk alone," she said. After a moment, she added, "Sutter grows bolder each season. Last week, I heard talk in townies asking the judge to grant him sole rights to the valley's river." Her hands tightened around her tin cup. "If he controls the water, ... double quotes, he controls everything," Eli finished. The firelight caught the lines of determination forming around his mouth. "Well, I reckon a man's got to stand for something in this life. These horses, your boy's father's dream, that's worth standing for. Sutter won't strip anyone else of their dignity. Not while I draw breath." David had been listening intently, fighting sleep. "We'll help too, won't we, Mama?" he asked, stifling a yawn. Annika reached out and squeezed her son's hand. "Yes, we will." She looked across the fire at Eli, her gaze steady and clear. Together, Eli nodded, feeling something long dormant stirring in his chest. Here in this firelit circle, with the herd breathing soft in the darkness and these two souls sharing his cause, he felt the weight of exile lifting. Providence, it seemed, had not forgotten him after all. They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned lower, each lost in their own thoughts, but bound by a common purpose. The silver stallion's distant nickering floated to them on the night wind, a reminder of the task and promise that lay ahead. The morning sun climbed higher as the trio guided their horses across the dusty plains. The massive herd moved like a flowing river behind them, hooves thundering against the parched earth. David rode close to Eli, mimicking the older man's steady posture in the saddle. Annika led the way, her dark hair bound back with a faded cloth. Scanning the horizon for the settlement she knew lay ahead. "Reckon we're about 2 hours from Miller's Creek," she said, pulling her mount to a walk. Dust coated her throat, making her voice rough. "There's a good mercantile there. We need supplies." Eli nodded, his face weathered and grave. "Best I stay with the herd outside town. Word of trouble travels fast out here, and my face ain't welcome in many places now." The silver stallion nickered softly from the head of the herd, as if agreeing with the caution in Eli's voice. David watched the magnificent creature with wondering eyes, still amazed at how it seemed to understand their movements, helping to guide the other horses by mid-morning. The first buildings of Miller's Creek came into view, a scatter of wooden structures that barely qualified as a town. They found a sheltered draw about a mile out, where a grove of cottonwoods offered shade and a thin creek provided water for the horses. "I won't be long," Annika said, straightening her simple dress. She squeezed David's shoulder. "Stay close to Eli, understand?" The boy nodded, already helping Eli arrange stones for a small fire. The trust between them had grown steadily over their days together, as natural as breathing. The mercantile's bell jingled as Annika stepped inside, the familiar smell of leather, coffee, and tobacco filling her nose. She gathered her items quietly: flour, salt, and a few other necessities. Near the back of the store, two ranch hands lounged against the counter, their voices carrying clearly in the quiet space. "Sutter's got it all planned out proper this time," the taller one said, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Filed them claims with Judge Harrison yesterday. Once it's approved, ain't no Indian or poor settler gonna have legal right to graze along that whole stretch of river." The other man chuckled. "'Bout time somebody put things in proper order. Can't have just anybody using good water." Annika's hands trembled as she counted out coins for her purchases. The storekeeper wrapped her goods in brown paper, avoiding her eyes. The ranch hand's words followed her out into the street like unwanted shadows when she returned to their camp. Eli knew something was wrong before she spoke a word. He helped her down from her horse, noting the tension in her shoulders. "What did you hear?" he asked softly as David tended the horses nearby. Annika's voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her fear. "Sutter's filed claims with the territorial judge, legal papers to make it against the law for any native family or poor settler to graze along the river. He's trying to take control of all the water rights." Eli's jaw tightened. He stared out at the herd, watching the sun glint off the silver stallion's coat. "This ain't about revenge on me anymore. He means to squeeze out every last person who won't bow to his rule." They waited until after their simple supper of beans and cornbread to discuss what they'd learned. David had fallen asleep against Eli's side, his young face peaceful in the firelight. The trust in that simple gesture made Eli's heart ache. "We could take the herd north," Annika said, her voice low and urgent. "There's good grazing in the high country. The Cherokee have kin there who would help us. Running won't solve it." Eli replied, absently stroking David's hair. "Sutter won't stop with just this valley. Men like him, they're never satisfied. They devour everything in their path, and if we run, we're leaving others to face him alone. It's not just about us anymore," Annika argued, gesturing to the sleeping boy. "I have to think of David. His father died standing up to men like Sutter." "I can't," her voice caught. Eli met her gaze across the fire. "Your husband died trying to protect something bigger than himself, something worth fighting for. These horses, this land, they belong to all of us, to the people, not to men who twist the law to serve their greed." The moon rose high and bright, casting silver shadows through the grove. The herd moved restlessly in the darkness, hooves shifting against the earth. The great stallion stood at the edge of the firelight, his coat gleaming like ghostly steel. "If we stay and fight," Annika said slowly, "we need more than just courage. We need a plan. Sutter has money, influence, men with guns. We have something he doesn't." Eli replied, looking down at David's sleeping form. "We have truth on our side. And maybe that's what Providence had in mind when it brought us together." The night wind whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying the soft sounds of the herd. Neither Eli nor Annika slept much, both knowing that their decision would shape not just their own fates, but the future of the valley itself. The silver stallion kept his vigil at the edge of their camp, as if standing guard against the battles yet to come. In the distance, a coyote called out to the moon, its cry lonely and wild, like the land itself crying out for justice. Eli and Annika sat in companionable silence, watching the embers fade to ash, each lost in thoughts of what tomorrow might bring. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as Eli guided his horse along a narrow trail, leading the massive herd behind him. The sound of hundreds of hooves echoed off the high walls of stone as they entered the box canyon. It was a natural fortress, hidden from prying eyes by towering cliffs that rose like ancient guardians on three sides. "This'll do for now," Eli called out to Annika and David, his voice carrying over the rumble of the herd. "These walls'll keep them safe while we figure our next move." The silver stallion trotted near the front, his mane catching the early light. The rest of the herd followed, spreading out across the canyon floor where patches of grass grew between weathered rocks. A small stream trickled down one wall, providing precious water. David dismounted eagerly, ready to help settle the horses. "Look how the walls go up so high," he exclaimed, neck craning back to take in the full height of the canyon. "Nobody'll find us here." Annika smiled at her son's enthusiasm while helping him collect dry wood for a morning fire. The canyon air was still cool, carrying the crisp scent of sage and morning dew. They had just got a small fire going when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them freeze. Eli's hand moved to his rifle, but what emerged around the canyon bend was not one of Sutter's men. Instead, a young man in a black coat rode in on a dun mare, a Bible secured to his saddle with rawhide straps. "Morning, folks," the rider called out softly, raising one hand in peaceful greeting. "Name's Josiah Pierce. I'm the circuit preacher for these parts." Eli kept his stance wary, positioning himself between the stranger and his companions. "This is mighty far from any church, preacher." Josiah dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "The Lord's work ain't confined to four walls, Mr. Ransom." He paused, his young face showing signs of internal struggle. "I've been following your trail since yesterday. There's something you ought to know." David edged closer to Eli, his eyes fixed on the preacher's face. "You know something about Sutter, don't you?" The question seemed to pierce Josiah's careful composure. He nodded, shame evident in his expression. "I did some work for him, helping to write up legal documents. Thought I was just earning my keep, spreading the word." He swallowed hard. "But what I saw? What he's planning, ... Annika stepped forward, her voice steady but concerned. "What exactly did you see, preacher?" Josiah reached into his saddlebag and pulled out some folded papers. "He's bought off the surveyors. They're redrawing property lines, changing the maps to show his ownership of land that's belonged to others. For generations." He looked directly at Eli, "including yours, Mr. Ransom, and the grazing lands the Cherokee have used since the treaties." Eli's jaw tightened. "That's why you came? To warn us?" "Partly," Josiah admitted, "but also because I can't stay silent anymore. The Lord commands us to stand against injustice." He pulled his Bible free from its straps. "I've been studying Scripture, seeking guidance. What Sutter's doing, ... It goes against everything holy." David tugged at Eli's sleeve. "He's telling the truth. I can tell." Eli studied the boy's earnest face, then looked back at the preacher. There was something in Josiah's manner, a mixture of shame and determination that rang true. After a long moment, he nodded. "Reckon we could use some help presenting our case to the judge." They gathered around the fire, all sharing coffee and what remained of their journey bread. Josiah spread out the papers he'd brought, explaining the legal terms and pointing out where Sutter had manipulated the records. "See here?" He pointed to a particular document. "These survey marks don't match the original territory maps. But Sutter's got men willing to swear they're accurate." Annika leaned in, her face grim. "How do we fight this?" "With truth," Josiah replied. "And witnesses. There are others who've seen what Sutter's doing, but they're scared to speak up. If we can show them they're not alone, ... double quotes. As the day wore on, they worked together, gathering evidence and forming a plan. David helped tend the horses, occasionally bringing water to the adults as they worked. The herd grazed peacefully in the background, the silver stallion keeping watch from a rocky outcrop when evening settled over the canyon. Josiah stood and opened his Bible. The firelight flickered across the worn pages as he began to speak. His voice soft but carrying clearly in the still air. "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good," he read. "And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." He looked up at his companions. "Fear is Sutter's weapon, but mercy and justice, those are God's tools, and they're stronger than any man's greed." The words seemed to settle into the very rocks around them. Even the horses grew quiet, as if listening. The silver stallion moved closer, its coat gleaming in the firelight. Eli stared into the flames, feeling something shift inside him. "When I got run out of the valley, I thought Providence had abandoned me," he said slowly. "But looking back, seems like each step led us here. You and David showing up with the herd, Annika." He glanced at Josiah. "And now you, with the very evidence we need." "Providence works in mysterious ways," Josiah agreed. "Bringing us together, giving us each a part to play in setting things right." The night deepened around them, stars appearing one by one above the canyon walls. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light on their faces. David had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder, peaceful despite the challenges ahead. The herd moved quietly in the darkness beyond the firelight, their presence a reminder of all they were fighting for. It wasn't just about the horses anymore. It was about standing up to injustice, about helping others find the courage to speak truth. "Tomorrow," Eli said quietly, "we start gathering those witnesses. Time to show folks they don't have to bow to fear." Annika nodded, gently stroking David's hair. "Together, together," Josiah echoed, closing his Bible with reverence. With faith and justice on our side, the fire burned low, its embers glowing like hope in the darkness. In the canyon's embrace, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of the herd, they found strength in their unlikely alliance. Providence, it seemed, had indeed brought them together for a greater purpose. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canyon as Eli and Josiah prepared their horses for the ride into town. Annika stood near the makeshift camp, her dark eyes filled with worry as she watched them check their saddles. "Be careful," she said softly, adjusting David's collar as he fidgeted beside her. "Sutter's men will be watching." Eli nodded, his weathered face grim. "We'll keep our heads down. Just need to see those papers, nothing more." He swung into his saddle, the leather creaking beneath him. Josiah mounted his own horse, his Bible secured in his saddlebag. The young preacher's usual eager expression had been replaced by something more serious. "The Lord will guide our steps," he said, though his voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. The two men rode out of the canyon just as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Behind them, the herd grazed peacefully, the silver stallion keeping watch over his charges. The steady clip-clop of hooves against hard-packed earth filled the morning air as they made their way toward town. The settlement appeared quiet at first glance, but Eli could feel the tension as soon as they reached the outskirts. Townsfolk hurried about their morning business, heads down, shoulders hunched. A few glanced their way, then quickly looked aside, as if afraid to be caught showing interest. "Like a storm's brewing," Josiah muttered, his hands tight on his reins. They tied their horses outside the courthouse, a plain wooden building that somehow managed to look both important and worn down at the same time. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the windows as they stepped inside. The clerk's office was cramped, barely large enough for a desk and a few chairs. The clerk himself, a thin man named Henderson, jumped slightly when they entered, his spectacles slipping down his nose. "Mr. Ransom," he stammered, I wasn't expecting ... just need to see some files." "Mr. Henderson," Eli said quietly, keeping his voice steady and calm. "About Sutter's recent claims. The clerk's hands shook as he pulled out a thick ledger. "Mr. Sutter's been quite busy with his filings," he said, flipping through the pages. "Claims to nearly every grazing acre along the river. And most of the water rights, too." Josiah leaned forward, his preacher's collar catching the dim light. "We'd like to review those papers, if you don't mind." Henderson glanced nervously at the door before spreading the ledger wide. There's some peculiarities," he whispered, pointing to several entries. "Gaps in the documentation. Places where the chain of ownership isn't quite clear." Eli studied the pages carefully, noting dates and locations. "These claims," he said, tapping one entry, "they don't account for prior agreements with the Cherokee, do they?" The clerk shook his head. "That's one of the irregularities. If someone could prove prior stewardship, especially with tribal agreements, ... double quotes, he left the sentence hanging. But his meaning was clear. A sudden commotion outside made them all freeze. Through the dusty window, Eli caught sight of two of Sutter's men walking down the street, their spurs jingling with each step. "Back door," Henderson whispered urgently. Through the storage room, Eli and Josiah moved quickly, their boots quiet on the wooden floor. They slipped through the narrow back door just as voices entered the front of the building. The alley behind the courthouse was narrow and shadowed, filled with empty crates and discarded papers. They retrieved their horses as quietly as possible, leading them down the alley before mounting. The sound of approaching boots spurred them into action. Eli dug his heels into his horse's flanks, and they burst from the alley in a cloud of dust. Shouts erupted behind them. The thunder of pursuing hooves echoed off the buildings as they galloped out of town. Dust filled the air, stinging their eyes and coating their throats, but they didn't slow. They took a winding path through the scrubland, using every trick Eli knew to throw off their pursuers. The sun was high overhead by the time they finally slowed, certain they'd lost anyone following them. Both men and horses were covered in a thick layer of dust. Their clothes and saddles turned a uniform shade of brown. "That was closer than I'd like," Josiah said, wiping his face with his bandana. Eli nodded grimly. "But we got what we needed to know. There's a way to fight this. We can prove the Cherokee claims." When they rode back into the Box Canyon, Annika and David rushed to meet them. The boys' eyes went wide at their dust-covered appearance. "Did you have to outrun the bad men?" he asked excitedly. Annika scolded gently, but her eyes were fixed on Eli's face. Reading the news there, Eli dismounted, his joints stiff from the hard ride. "Sutter's trying to claim it all," he said, accepting the canteen Annika offered. "But there's hope. The clerk showed us gaps in his paperwork. If we can prove prior agreements with the Cherokee, especially about grazing rights." Annika's expression changed. Without a word, she hurried to their camp and pulled a small trunk from beneath a blanket. The trunk was old, but well cared for, its leather straps still strong. She opened it carefully and withdrew a bundle of papers, yellowed with age but clearly preserved with great care. "My husband's papers," she said softly, holding them as if they were more precious than gold. "Agreements with the territorial governor, tribal council records, maps showing the traditional grazing lands." She pressed them into Eli's hands, her fingers lingering for a moment. "He kept everything. Said someday we might need to prove our rights to the land." Eli handled the documents carefully, aware of their importance. Josiah moved closer, examining the official seals and signatures visible on the top page. "These could be exactly what we need," the preacher said, his voice filled with quiet awe. "These aren't just papers, they're the truth about who this land really belongs to." Annika nodded, her face both proud and sad. "My husband believed in keeping records, in having proof. He said words could vanish like smoke, but what's written down stays to tell its story." David pressed against his mother's side, looking at the papers with new understanding. "Papa's papers are going to help us save the herd. "Yes, son," Eli said, carefully wrapping the documents back up. "Your father's wisdom might just save more than the herd. It might save the whole valley from Sutter's greed." The afternoon sun slanted through the canyon walls, painting everything in warm, golden light. The herd grazed peacefully nearby, the silver stallion keeping his eternal watch. In that moment, holding the precious papers, Eli felt the weight of responsibility settle more firmly on his shoulders. These weren't just documents, they were a legacy of trust, hope, and justice, passed from one protector to another. The midday sun beat down on the Box Canyon as Eli, Annika, Josiah, and David gathered near the shifting herd. The silver stallion stood apart, his mane catching the light like spun moonbeams. 200 horses milled about in the natural corral, their coats dusty but well-bred lines clear to any horseman's eye. "These horses tell their own story," Eli said, running his hand along a young mare's flank. "Your husband's breeding shows in every one of them. The way they move, their build-ant, natural wild stock." Annika nodded, pride and grief mingling in her expression. "He kept careful records of every foal, every bloodline. Said a well-tended herd was like a living book of our people's care for the land." David bounced on his toes, eager to help. "Pa taught me some of the bloodlines before he passed. That bay mare there," he pointed to a muscular horse with a white star on her forehead, "she comes from Thundercloud's line. Best cow horses in the territory." "That's right," Annika said softly, squeezing her son's shoulder. "And that knowledge is part of what will show the judge." Eli turned to David, his eyes kind but serious. "Speaking of knowledge, reckon it's time you learned to move proper among the herd. Can't just charge in like a wild thing. Horses need trust, same as people." David's face lit up. "You mean I can help with the horses?" "If your ma agrees." Eli glanced at Annika, who gave a small nod. "First lesson's about patience. Watch how I approach," Eli demonstrated, moving slow and steady toward a cluster of horses. His boots made soft sounds in the dirt, his breathing calm and measured. The horses' ears flicked toward him, but didn't shy away. David watched, transfixed, as Eli worked his way through the herd without causing a single horse to startle. "See how he keeps his shoulders relaxed," Annika explained to her son. "That's what your father always said, tension travels down the lead rope faster than lightning." For the next hour, Eli guided David in approaching different horses. The boy's natural enthusiasm had to be contained, but his quick mind grasped the importance of moving with purpose rather than haste. When David successfully touched his first horse's neck without spooking it, his grin could have lit up the darkest night. Meanwhile, Josiah sat in the shade of a scrub oak, his Bible open on his knee as he scratched away at some paper with a stubby pencil. His brow furrowed in concentration as he worked to craft his statement. "The truth needs careful telling," he murmured when Eli walked over to check on him. "Gotta make sure every word carries weight with the judge." The afternoon wore on, the sun tracking west as they continued their work. David practiced his quiet walking, Annika sorted through her husband's papers, and Josiah refined his testimony. The horses moved like water around them, accepting their presence with growing ease. As evening approached, Annika built a small fire and set a pot of beans to cook. The aroma mixed with the sage-scented air, making their simple meal seem like a feast. They gathered around the flames as the first stars appeared, sharing tin cups of coffee and fresh-baked cornbread. Josiah set aside his empty plate, his young face troubled in the firelight. "There's something I need to say," he began, voice rough with emotion. "Something that's been weighing heavy on my conscience." The others grew still, watching him across the dancing flames. 2 months back, Sutter came to me with money. Said he needed a man of God, too, to speak well of him to the territorial judge. Josiah's hands twisted in his lap. I took it. Lord help me. I took his silver dollars and kept my mouth shut when he started pushing folks off their land. silence fell, broken only by the pop and crackle of burning wood. David pressed closer to his mother's side, while Eli's face remained carefully neutral. "But I can't sleep peaceful anymore," Josiah continued. "Been reading my Bible, praying for guidance. And I know now what's right ain't always what's safe." He looked up, meeting their eyes one by one. "I'm ready to stand with you folks, even if it costs me everything. Truth's worth more than 30 pieces of silver." Eli studied the young preacher for a long moment. Then he reached across the fire and clasped Josiah's shoulder. "Reckon the good book says something about joy over one sinner that repents. More joy than over 99 just persons." Josiah finished, a tremulous smile breaking through his shame. "Then you're welcome as a brother in our cause," Eli said firmly. "We all got our past regrets. It's what we choose now that matters." Annika added another stick to the fire, sending sparks swirling up toward the star-filled sky. "Tomorrow, we'll start gathering statements from other families Sutter's wronged. The more voices speak truth, the harder it is to silence them all." The night deepened around their small camp. On the ridgeline above, coyotes began their evening chorus, their wild songs echoing off the canyon walls. The herd shifted and murmured in response, hooves scraping against stone. The silver stallion's watchful form visible in the moonlight. David had dozed off against his mother's shoulder, his young face peaceful. Josiah returned to his written testimony, making careful corrections by firelight. Eli sat with his coffee cup cooling in his hands, watching the horses move like shadows through the darkness. The air grew cooler, carrying the promise of dawn and decisions yet to come. But for now, they had found their path forward, deed papers that proved prior claims, a living herd that showed generations of careful breeding, and witnesses ready to speak truth no matter the cost. It wasn't just about horses anymore. It was about standing together against the kind of greed that would steal a whole valley's future. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with sunlight spilling over the eastern ridge. Eli adjusted his faded but freshly brushed Sunday coat as he and Josiah mounted their horses for the ride into town. The young preacher carried his worn Bible, its leather cover softened by years of handling. "Reckon folks might be surprised to see me at service," Eli said, his voice quiet in the morning air. Josiah nodded, checking his saddle straps. "The Lord's house turns no one away, Brother Eli, even though some men would exile." They rode at an easy pace, hooves crunching on the packed dirt trail. Church bells rang in the distance, their clear tones carrying across the valley. As they approached town, Eli noticed curtains twitching in windows and townsfolk averting their eyes. A few children stared openly before being hurried along by their parents. The white-painted church stood modest but proud against the morning sky, its small steeple reaching heavenward. Horses were hitched all around, and well-dressed families climbed the wooden steps. Conversation died as Eli and Josiah dismounted. The silence felt heavy as storm clouds. Inside, lamplight caught the dust motes dancing in the air. Eli took a seat in the back pew, aware of the space people left around him. The wooden bench creaked beneath him as the congregation settled. Josiah moved to the front, opening his Bible with steady hands. "Brothers and sisters," Josiah began, his voice clear and strong. "Today we examine Psalm 82. Verse 3, defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy." The young preacher's words filled the hushed church. The Lord demands we protect those who cannot protect themselves. When we see the widow stripped of her rights, when we witness the poor man driven from his home, when greed masquerades as law, we cannot remain silent. Eli watched, heads bow and shoulders shift uncomfortably. Josiah continued, his voice rising with conviction. "What profit a man to gain the whole valley, yet lose his soul? When we allow injustice to prosper, we share in its sin. When we stay silent in the face of wrong, our silence becomes approval. The congregation sat stiff-backed and solemn. Some nodded slowly, while others gripped their hymnals with white knuckles. Though Sutter's name never passed Josiah's lips, his meaning rang clear as the church bells. After the final hymn, Eli stepped out into the Sunday morning sunshine. He had barely reached his horse when a familiar voice cut through the murmur of departing worshippers. Seems like some men need reminding what exile means. Clive Sutter stood at the bottom of the church steps, his expensive boots planted wide. Two of his ranch hands flanked him, hands hovering near their gun belts. Eli turned slowly, keeping his voice level. Seems like some men need reminding that God's law stands above any man's God's law. Sutter sneered, closing the distance between them. You're looking mighty righteous for a horse thief. Maybe you need to learn that exile means death if you don't clear out. The crowd grew still, forming a circle around the two men. Eli felt their eyes on him, but kept his gaze steady on Sutter. You can strip a man of his land, Sutter. You can turn folks against him. But you can't take his integrity. That ain't yours to touch. Sutter's face darkened. His hand twitched toward his holster. The air crackled with tension as the two men faced each other, neither willing to back down. Gentlemen, Josiah's calm voice cut through the silence as he stepped between them. This is holy ground. Surely we can part in peace on the Lord's day. Peace. Sutter spat. There'll be peace when this exile remembers his place. But the preacher's presence had broken the moment. Sutter turned away, his boot heels striking the packed earth like hammer blows as he strode to his waiting horse. The tension slowly leaked from the air as the crowd dispersed. Eli felt the trembling in his hands ease as he mounted up. He and Josiah rode back to camp in thoughtful silence, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. They found Annika tending the cook fire, while David practiced his roping skills on a post. The boy's face lit up at their return, but Annika's eyes held worry as she studied their expressions. After David was settled in his bedroll that evening, Annika and Eli sat by the dying fire. The stars spread like scattered diamonds across the dark sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. I heard about what happened at church, Annika said softly. Word travels fast, even to those of us who weren't welcome there. She poked at the embers with a stick. Sutter won't let this rest. No, Eli agreed. He won't. You could have stayed away, stayed safe. Her dark eyes reflected the firelight as she looked at him. Why risk yourself? Eli was quiet for a long moment, watching David's peaceful sleeping form. Because some things are worth standing for. Your husband knew that. He stood up for these horses for what was right. He met her gaze. A man can't run forever. Sometimes he has to plant his feet and face what comes. Annika's hand found his in the darkness, warm and strong. You're a brave man, Eli Ransom. Foolish, maybe, but brave. Something stirred in Eli's heart at her touch, at the gentle strength in her voice. It was more than friendship, more than the alliance of their cause. It felt like hope, like the promise of spring after a long winter. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead while the herd grazed peacefully in the darkness beyond the viral. David murmured something in his sleep and turned over, pulling his blanket tighter. Eli found himself smiling at the boy's innocent trust, at how natural it felt to want to protect him. Here in this moment, despite the danger ahead, he felt more at peace than he had since Sarah's death. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks dancing upward like fireflies. Tomorrow would bring its own battles. But for now, this was enough, this quiet moment. This shared warmth. This feeling of belonging that had been missing from his life for so long. Thunder rolled across the canyon walls. But it wasn't from any storm. The sound of hoofbeats and gunfire shattered the peaceful night, echoing off the rocky slopes like demons unleashed. Eli jerked awake, his heart pounding as riders materialized from the darkness, their forms backlit by the dying campfire. Raiders. Josiah's shout cut through the chaos just as the first shots cracked overhead. Eli scrambled to his feet, recognizing Sutter's men by their silhouettes. They drove their horses through the camp, trampling supplies and scattering burning logs. The peaceful canyon erupted into mayhem as the wild herd panicked, their thundering hooves drowning out even the gunfire. David. Annika's scream pierced the night. "Where's my son?" Eli spotted the boy near the horse line, trying to calm the frightened animals. The silver stallion reared nearby, fighting against the ropes that Sutter's men were throwing. David reached for the horse's lead, but stumbled in the darkness. No. Eli sprinted forward as the herd surged around them. Horses stampeded past, their eyes wild with terror. David disappeared in the sea of flowing manes and pounding hooves. The boy's cry of pain cut through Eli's heart like a knife. He dove through the chaos, shouldering past panicked horses until he reached David. The boy lay crumpled on the ground, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Hold on." Son Eli gathered David in his arms as Annika reached them. Her face was ghostly in the scattered firelight, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "My baby," she sobbed, cradling David's head, while Yali carried him to safety behind a boulder. The silver stallion's scream of rage echoed off the canyon walls. Through the dust and chaos, Eli saw Sutter's men dragging the fighting horse away with heavy ropes. The proud animal fought every step, but there were too many lines holding him. The herd? Josiah shouted from somewhere in the darkness. "They're scattering into the hills." Eli wanted to chase after them, to stop Sutter's men, but David's whimpers of pain held him fast. The boy needed him more than the horses did. He watched helplessly as their beautiful herd disappeared into the night, driven in all directions by Sutter's raiders. The attack was over almost as quickly as it had begun. In its wake, their camp lay in ruins. The wagon was overturned, supplies scattered and trampled. Their food stores were destroyed, and what remained of the campfire had been kicked into their tent. Leaving it in ashes, David Eli turned his attention to the injured boy. "Can you tell me where it hurts?" My leg." David gasped through clenched teeth. "It feels like fire." Annika's hand shook as she gently felt along her son's leg. "It's broken," she said, her voice hollow. "Oh, Creator, it's broken badly." Eli took charge, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. "Josiah, find me 2 straight branches about arm's length. Annika, tear strips from what's left of the tent. We need bandages." They worked together in the darkness, using the branches to fashion a crude splint. David bore the pain bravely, though tears streamed down his face. Eli's gentle hands and soft words helped keep the boy calm as they secured the broken leg. "There now," Eli said, squeezing David's hand. "You're being mighty strong." Son, the night stretched endlessly before them as they kept vigil around what remained of their fire. David finally fell into an exhausted sleep, his head resting in his mother's lap. Annika stroked his hair, her face a mask of worry and grief. How could Providence allow this? She whispered bitterly into the darkness. "We were doing what was right. We were standing against evil." And now her voice broke as she looked down at her injured child. Eli sat silent, unable to find words of comfort. The weight of their losses pressed down on him like a physical thing. The herd scattered, their supplies destroyed, and worst of all, David's injury. Had he led them all into disaster with his stubborn determination to fight? The silver stallion's absence felt like a hole in his chest. That magnificent creature now in Sutter's cruel hands. The thought of what awaited the proud horse made Eli's jaw clench with helpless anger. Through the longest hours of the night, they tended to David, Josiah prayed softly, his words carrying on the cool wind. Eli kept the fire fed with what little wood they had left, the flames casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls. Each time David stirred in pain, Annika would sing softly to him in Cherokee, her voice thick with unshed tears. Dawn approached with agonizing slowness. As the sky began to lighten, they could finally see the full extent of the destruction. Their camp, once a place of hope and planning, was now little more than scattered debris. Hoofprints marked the ground like scars, telling the story of violence and fear. Eli stood at the canyon's edge, watching the sun rise over the eastern hills. In the growing light, he could see a few horses that had remained nearby, perhaps a dozen out of their once mighty herd. The rest were gone, scattered to the four winds by Sutter's raiders. David's quiet moan drew him back to their makeshift camp. The boy's face was pale with pain, his splinted leg propped carefully on Eli's saddle blanket. Annika hadn't moved from his side all night, her own exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "The leg needs proper doctoring," Josiah said quietly. "He can't stay out here," Eli nodded, knowing the preacher was right. But moving David would cause him terrible pain, and they had no wagon now. Every option before them seemed impossible. The morning light revealed their true situation. They were broken, scattered, and nearly defeated, just like their beloved herd. Eli felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, threatening to crush what remained of his spirit. Annika's earlier words echoed in his mind. Had Providence truly turned away? He watched David's brave struggle with pain, saw Annika's devotion to her son, remembered Josiah's steadfast prayers through the night. Somewhere in all this darkness, there had to be light. But in that moment, as the sun rose over their ruined camp, Eli couldn't find the words to say so. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruined camp as Eli helped fashion a travois from salvaged tent poles and blankets. His muscles ached from the sleepless night, but determination kept him moving. They had to get David proper care, and quickly. The mission doctor, Annika said, her voice rough from exhaustion. "He's skilled with broken bones." 2 hours' ride past the reservation boundary. Eli nodded, carefully securing the makeshift stretcher to his horse. "We'll take it slow and steady." Every step careful. They lifted David as gently as possible onto the travois. But even that small movement drew a sharp gasp of pain from the boy. Annika whispered soothing words in Cherokee while Josiah adjusted the blankets around him. The journey proved grueling. The travois bumped over every rock and dip despite Eli's careful guidance. David tried to be brave, but small moans escaped him whenever they crossed particularly rough ground. They stopped often to check his splint and give him sips of water. The late sun climbed high and hot as they picked their way across dry scrubland. Dust coated their throats and sweat stained their clothes. Skeleton bushes cast thin shadows that offered little relief from the heat. At each rocky wash, they had to test the ground carefully before crossing. It was late afternoon when they finally reached the whitewashed walls of the mission. The doctor, a gentle-faced man with gray at his temples, met them at the door. His skilled hands examined David's leg with careful precision. "A clean break," he announced after setting the bone properly. "With rest and care, he'll heal strong again." Youth is on his side. Relief washed over them all, but it was short-lived. As the doctor worked, Josiah returned from talking with other patients in the mission's common room. His face was grim. "Sutter's already showing off the silver stallion in town," he reported quietly, parading him up and down the street, claiming him as rightful property. Eli's hands clenched into fists. The thought of that proud creature under Sutter's control made his blood boil. He started to rise, but Annika's hand caught his, her touch cool against his anger. "Vengeance would only prove him right about you," she said softly. "About all of us. We must be better than that." That night, Lying on a thin mattress in the mission's bunkhouse, Eli struggled with his thoughts. The day's journey had exhausted his body, but his mind wouldn't rest. He turned to prayer, something he hadn't done properly since losing his wife. "Lord," he whispered into the darkness, "I need strength. Not for myself, but for them." For what's right, as he prayed, a peculiar warmth settled in his chest. It wasn't an answer exactly, but it felt like a reminder. Faith, like hope, could spark even in the darkest moments. For the first time since the raid, Eli felt his resolve returning. Stronger than before, Dr. Matthews emerged from the small mission infirmary, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The boy's leg is set proper now. He'll need plenty of rest, but youth's on his side. He should heal clean with time." Eli's shoulders sagged with relief. Beside him, Annika pressed her hands together in silent thanks. The morning sun streamed through the mission's weathered windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. "Much obliged," Dr. Eli said, his voice thick with gratitude. "We were mighty worried." The doctor's kind eyes crinkled. "That makeshift splint you made saved him from worse harm. Shows you knew what you were about." He paused, frowning. "Though I hear tell it wasn't any accident that caused this." Annika's face tightened. "Sutter's men scattered our herd. David got caught in the stampede." Sutter. The doctor spat the name like it tasted bitter. "That man's been crushing folks under his boot for too long. Just last month, he ran the Weber family clean off their land. Used some paper claiming their creek was his property." Josiah, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Dr. Matthews, would you be willing to make a sworn statement about David's injury? And about other harm you've seen from Sutter's actions?" The doctor straightened, resolve hardening his features. "I surely would. Been keeping notes on every injury I've treated that came from that man's cruelty. Figured someday someone would stand up to him." Over the next 2 days, they made the mission their base. David rested in a clean bed, his spirit brightening despite his injury. Eli spent hours at his bedside, teaching him to whittle and telling stories of his own boyhood. Word spread through the small settlement that someone was finally challenging Sutter. People began arriving at the mission, each carrying their own tale of injustice. Josiah wrote down their testimonies, his careful hand recording every detail. A farmer named Suze Thompson described how Sutter's men had dammed the creek above his land, leaving his crops to wither. The widow Carson told of threats against her son when he refused to sell their small ranch. Each story built upon the last, creating a pattern of corruption and intimidation. On the second evening, Eli sat at a rough wooden table, writing his own account by lamplight. His pen scratched across the paper as he described his exile, the wild herd, and Sutter's escalating violence. Annika watched him work, her presence steady and encouraging. "You write well," she observed softly. "Each word carries truth." Eli paused, flexing his cramped fingers. "Truth's all I've got left to fight with." "That and these," he gestured to the pile of testimonies beside him. David called out from his bed across the room. "Tell them about the silver stallion, Eli, how he chose to trust you, how Sutter stole him." Eli's jaw tightened at the mention of the magnificent horse. Through the mission's window, he could see the distant lights of the town where Sutter now kept the stallion captive. "I aim to get him back, David. Him and all the others. It's not just about the horses anymore," David said, his young voice carrying wisdom beyond his years. "It's about all the children who ought to grow up free to ride where they please. Indian and white alike." Annika moved to her son's bedside, smoothing his dark hair. Pride shone in her eyes at his words. "My husband would have said the same," she murmured. The next morning, Dr. Matthews delivered his sworn statement, the paper covered in his precise medical terminology. He had included dates, names, and detailed descriptions of injuries treated. "This here's evidence no one can dispute," he said firmly. Josiah organized all the documents, binding them carefully with twine. We have Anika's deed papers showing her husband's legal claim to the grazing lands. We have 24 testimonies from respectable folks. We have my own confession about taking Sutter's bribes. He looked up at Eli. It's time to take this to Judge Harrison. Eli nodded slowly. Reckon you're right. But first, I need to do something. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write, his words flowing steadily to Judge Harrison and all honest men of this territory. I stand before you not just as Eli Ransom, a man unjustly exiled, but as a witness to greater wrongs. I've seen Clive Sutter use fear and false law to steal what belongs to all people, the right to live free and proud on their own land. ... He wrote through the morning, pouring out everything he had seen and learned. When he finished, Anika read it over, tears gleaming in her eyes. This will speak to hearts as well as minds, she said softly. David insisted on having the testimony read to him. When Eli finished, the boy's face was set with determination. You go make this right, he said firmly. I'll be fine here with the doctor. Anika kissed her son's forehead. We'll return as soon as we can. She gathered her husband's precious deed papers, handling them with reverence. Josiah packed their documents carefully in his saddlebags. The judge holds court tomorrow morning. We should reach town by nightfall if we leave now, as they prepared to ride out. Dr. Matthews pressed a final paper into Eli's hands. My personal letter to the judge. He and I served together in the war. Might help him see clear to justice. The morning sun was climbing higher as they mounted up. Eli took one last look at the mission, where David waved from his window. The boy's courage strengthened his resolve. They would face Sutter and his threats. They would reclaim the silver stallion. Most importantly, they would restore justice to the valley. Providence has led us this far. Josiah said quietly as they turned their horses toward town. It won't abandon us now. Eli felt the weight of their gathered testimonies in his saddlebags, the proof of so many wrongs, the hopes of so many people. The silver stallion's absence pulled at his heart, but he knew that some battles needed more than just strength to win. They needed truth, witnessed and spoken clear as they rode out. The mission bell told the hour, its clear notes carrying across the valley. The sound seemed to echo Eli's silent prayer that tomorrow would bring justice, not just for him, but for all those who had suffered under Sutter's shadow. Dawn broke over the courthouse, its weathered boards glowing amber in the early light. Eli guided the borrowed mission wagon carefully through town, mindful of David's splinted leg. The boy sat propped between Anika and Josiah, his face tight with discomfort but determined. Sutter's men lounged against hitching posts, their hands resting too close to their guns. Their cold stares followed Eli's group as they made their way inside. The courthouse filled quickly, shoulders pressed tight in the cramped space as Judge Harrison took his seat, his gray beard neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp beneath bushy brows. Sutter strode forward first, confidence oozing from every movement. Through the open doors, his men led the silver stallion into view. The magnificent horse tossed his head, fighting the rough hands that held him. Your Honor, Sutter proclaimed, this wild stallion, caught on my land, proves my right to claim these territories. No one else has shown proper ownership of these herds. The judge nodded slowly, making notes with his quill. Mr. Ransom, your response. Eli stood, his boots scuffing the wooden floor. Anika passed him the carefully preserved documents, her fingers brushing his for courage. Your Honor, I present deed papers and tribal agreements showing these lands and herds were legally stewarded by Samuel Snowbird, Mrs. Snowbird's late husband. Josiah stepped forward next, his voice steady. I must confess that Mr. Sutter paid me to keep quiet about his illegal claims. I have documented dates and amounts of these bribes." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge's eyebrows lifted as he examined the papers, but Sutter's laugh cut through the tension. "Wild horses running loose prove nothing," he sneered. "And you expect us to trust Indian papers?" Before the judge could respond, Timothy Wells, the town shopkeeper, rose from his seat. "Your Honor, I've seen Sutter's men threaten folks who wouldn't sell their land. Watched them dam up Weber's Creek till his crops died. The blacksmith, Jacob Miller, stood next. He tried to force me to shoe his horses for free. Said he'd run me out of business if I refused." One by one, more townspeople rose, their voices joining together: the seamstress, the cooper, the freight wagon driver. Each shared their story of Sutter's intimidation and greed. Judge Harrison's face darkened as he listened. When the last person finished, he brought down his gavel with a sharp crack. "I've heard enough," he declared. "All of Mr. Sutter's land claims are hereby suspended pending a full investigation. This court will reconvene in 1 week to examine every piece of evidence presented today." His stern gaze swept the room. "And let it be known, any interference with witnesses will be dealt with severely." The courthouse doors banged open as Sutter stormed onto the boardwalk, his face twisted with rage. "This ain't over, Ransom," he snarled, jabbing a finger toward Eli. "You and that Cherokee woman think you've won. I built this valley." His men crowded behind him, hands hovering near their gun belts. The silver stallion danced nervously at the end of his lead rope, still held firmly in Eli's grip. "The only thing you built was fear, Sutter," Tom Wheeler called out, stepping forward to stand beside Eli. "And that's done now." Sarah Miller and several other townsfolk moved to join them, forming a wall of bodies between Sutter and Eli's group. Sutter's face reddened further as he watched his influence crumbling before his eyes. With a roar of frustration, Sutter lunged forward, swinging wildly at Eli. 2 of his men seized the moment, drawing their pistols. But before they could level their weapons, Sheriff Matthews and his deputies pushed through the crowd. "Drop those guns," the sheriff ordered, his own revolver already drawn. "You're under arrest for attempting to incite violence." The 2 men hesitated, then slowly lowered their weapons. Sheriff Matthews nodded to his deputies, who quickly moved in to disarm and handcuff them. "This is your doing," Sutter spat at Eli, but his voice had lost its power. The townspeople watched silently as the sheriff led Sutter's men away. Judge Harrison appeared on the courthouse steps, his voice carrying across the tense scene. "The Silver Stallion is hereby returned to the care of Eli Ransom and Annika Snowbird." As representatives of the valley's rightful horse stewards, Eli stroked the stallion's silvery mane, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered against the horse's neck. The magnificent animal nickered softly, as if sensing the shift in fortunes. As evening approached, riders appeared on the horizon, friendly cowhands who had helped gather the scattered herd. The thunder of hundreds of hooves filled the valley as the horses returned home. Guided by their silver leader, Eli and Annika rode together at the head of the drive, their shoulders nearly touching. Behind them, David sat propped up in the wagon, his splinted leg cushioned by blankets, his face glowing with joy. Josiah rode nearby, occasionally raising his voice in hymns of praise. They guided the herd to the newly designated communal grazing grounds, along the riverland that would now be shared fairly, as Judge Harrison had decreed. The setting sun painted the water gold as the horses moved down to drink as darkness fell. Campfires bloomed along the riverbank. Families gathered, bringing food and blankets, celebrating the return of justice to their valley. The night air filled with music as people raised their voices together in familiar hymns. Lantern light caught the Silver Stallion's coat as he grazed peacefully among his herd, finally home where he belonged. Dawn painted the eastern sky in brushstrokes of pink and gold. washing across the valley like honey spilling from heaven's cup. Eli stirred from his bedroll, the morning dew dampening his blanket. The air held that special freshness that came only with sunrise. Carrying the sweet scent of sage and prairie grass, 200 horses grazed peacefully in the meadow below, their coats gleaming in the early light. The sight made Eli's heart swell. No longer were they fugitives, but free creatures on their rightful land. Near the dying embers of last night's fire, Tika knelt gracefully, coaxing new flames to life. The aroma of coffee soon mingled with the morning air. David sat propped against a fallen log, his splinted leg carefully arranged on a folded blanket. A curious foal had wandered close, stretching its velvety nose toward the boy. David's laughter rang out pure and clear as the young horse snuffled his hair. "Time to move on," Josiah announced, securing his saddlebags. The young preacher's face held both sadness and purpose. "Other towns need to hear about justice and mercy." Eli clasped his arm firmly. "You'll always have friends here, brother. The Lord works in mysterious ways." Josiah smiled, mounting his horse. Who would have thought exile could lead to such blessing? With a final wave, he rode east toward the rising sun. The silver stallion stood quietly as Eli saddled him, the horse's trust a gift earned through gentle patience. Together they climbed the ridge overlooking the valley, hooves crunching on loose shale. At the top, Eli reined in, letting his gaze sweep across the land that had cast him out and then welcomed him home. The sound of another horse approaching made him turn. Annika guided her mount alongside his, her dark hair catching the morning light. Without words, she reached across and placed her hand in his. Their fingers intertwined, speaking what hearts already knew. Below them, the herd began to move. Like a river of muscle and spirit, 200 horses flowed across the plain. Their hoofbeats rolled like thunder, shaking the earth with the power of freedom. The silver stallion lifted his head high, trumpeting a call that echoed off the valley walls. "I lost everything once," Eli said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "My wife, my land, my place among neighbors." He squeezed Annika's hand gently. "But standing for truth brought me more than I ever dreamed possible. It brought me home." Annika's smile held all the warmth of the rising sun. "Perhaps Providence never truly abandons those who keep faith," she said. Together, they watched the herd run free, a living testament to redemption and hope, while morning light blessed the land with promise. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.